The morning my son drove me to the care home, he hugged me longer than usual. His voice trembled just enough to sound convincing. "Just for a little while, Mom," he said, "until things settle." My doctor had said the same thing the day before, sitting across from me with that careful expression physicians use when they want to sound compassionate, but have already made up their minds. I believed them. What I didn't know was that by the time I packed my suitcase, the old burgundy one my husband bought in Verona in 1989, my son had already scheduled the locksmith. And while I was being shown my temporary room, he was standing on my porch, watching my front door get a brand new lock. That was the moment I learned something that still turns my stomach when I think about it. My own son hadn't convinced me to move into a care home. He had been planning to remove me from my life for 2 years, and he hadn't done it alone. My doctor helped him. Hello, my dear friends. Grace here. I'm glad you're spending this time with me today. When I first heard Margaret's story, I had to sit quietly for a moment. Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes dressed as concern. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 75 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I lived in the same brick house in Cedar Hill, where my husband Daniel and I spent 42 years of our lives. It's the house where my son Andrew learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway, and where our apple tree still leans slightly to the east after a storm back in 1998. I planted that tree myself with a rusted garden spade and a stubborn determination that something living should remain long after Daniel and I were gone. For most of my life, I was the sort of woman people described as practical. I paid bills on time, kept careful folders in a teak filing cabinet Daniel built in his workshop, and I never once in 75 years forgot where I put the house keys. Which is why what happened next still feels like a cruel kind of theater. 2 months ago, Andrew started visiting more often than usual. At first, I thought it was sweet. Children get busy with their own lives, jobs, mortgages, grandchildren that arrive smelling like milk and talcum powder. So when your son suddenly shows up twice a week with groceries and questions about how you're sleeping, you tend to feel grateful rather than suspicious. But Andrew didn't ask about ordinary things. He asked strange questions. "Mom, have you ever forgotten to turn the stove off? Mom, do you ever get confused about the day of the week? Mom, where do you keep the house documents again?" The first few times I laughed it off. I told him I might forget where my spectacles are, but I've never forgotten a stove burner in my life. Still, the questions kept coming. Then came the doctor visits. My physician, Dr. Leonard Kessler, had been treating me for almost 10 years. A quiet man, always polite, always measured. At first, he simply suggested routine cognitive assessments, memory tests, word lists, little puzzles printed on white paper. He said they were standard for people my age. I remember one appointment particularly well. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee from the machine in the corner. A television murmured quietly above the reception desk, while a nurse shuffled papers with the bored efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Dr. Kessler asked me to remember 3 words: apple, carpet, silver. Then he asked me again 10 minutes later. I remembered them perfectly. He smiled, wrote something down, closed the folder. I didn't realize then that what he wrote in that folder would eventually be used to prove that I could no longer live in my own home. The idea of the care home first appeared during dinner one evening. Andrew had brought over a container of chicken fricassee from a little French place downtown, the kind with thyme and mushrooms that melt in your mouth. We were sitting at my kitchen table under the old brass light fixture Daniel installed decades ago.
I assume he can.
Andrew stirred his wine slowly and said, very gently, "Mom,
So,
have you ever thought about moving somewhere safer?"
he's gonna.
I remember the way my fork paused halfway to my mouth. "Safer than my own kitchen?" I asked. He laughed a little too quickly.
But yeah.
"Just somewhere with people around, medical staff,
He's like growing
you know,
up and stuff.
just in case."
Stop it.
I told him I would think about it. But the next week he came back with brochures, glossy photographs, smiling seniors playing chess, bright dining halls with linen napkins folded like little swans, words like independence, community, peace of mind printed in soft blue fonts. And every time I hesitated, Dr. Kessler gently reinforced the same message. "Margaret, it might be a wise transitional step. Transitional. Temporary. Just until things settle." Those were the words they used over and over. Eventually, after enough conversations that felt strangely rehearsed, I agreed to try it for a few weeks. I packed only one suitcase, a few dresses, my knitting bag, a small tin of Darjeeling tea I keep for quiet afternoons, and the burgundy suitcase from Verona. The morning Andrew drove me there, he kept the car radio turned low and talked about trivial things. The weather, construction on Maple Avenue, the price of avocados. I remember thinking how oddly calm he seemed. The care home itself was called Silver Pines Residence. The lobby smelled of lemon polish and something faintly medicinal. A large aquarium bubbled near the reception desk, while two residents sat in armchairs watching a daytime quiz show. A cheerful woman named Carol showed me to my room. "Just temporary, of course," Andrew said. I nodded. We hugged, and then he left. At exactly 11:42 that morning. Later that afternoon, I asked to borrow the front desk phone. I dialed my home number out of habit, expecting the answering machine to pick up with my own recorded voice. But the line never rang. It went straight to silence. At the time, I thought it must be a telephone issue. It wasn't until the next morning, when my neighbor Linda finally answered my call, that I learned the truth. "Margaret," she said slowly, "I thought you knew. Your son had a locksmith here yesterday." My fingers tightened around the phone. "A locksmith?" "Yes. They changed the locks on your front door." I felt something cold settle quietly in my chest, because suddenly, every strange conversation, every memory test, every gentle suggestion began to align like pieces of a puzzle I never realized I was solving. And for the first time in 75 years, I understood something terrifying. I had not moved out of my house. I had been removed from it. That first night in Silver Pines, I barely slept. The room they gave me was clean enough, I suppose. Too clean in the way places feel when they're scrubbed more for liability than comfort. The bed was narrow, the mattress stiff, and the curtains had a pattern of pale blue leaves that reminded me vaguely of hospital gowns. Someone had placed a bowl of wax fruit on the dresser beside a plastic lamp that hummed faintly when switched on. Temporary, I reminded myself. Just a few weeks. I unpacked slowly that afternoon, placing my things with quiet precision. My knitting bag went beside the armchair. My Darjeeling tea tin sat near the kettle. The burgundy suitcase from Verona slid neatly under the bed. When you reach 75, routines become small anchors. I made my tea exactly the way I always do. Water just below boiling, 2 minutes steeping, 1 drop of honey. But when I lifted the cup to my lips, the tea tasted wrong. Not the tea itself. The room. The silence in it. Silver Pines had a strange rhythm at night. Doors clicked shut. Distant televisions murmured through walls. Somewhere down the hall, a woman coughed in a dry, persistent rhythm, like an old metronome. At around 9 o'clock, a staff member knocked lightly and stepped in without waiting for an answer.
kind of thing.
A young
I was
man,
down
perhaps
there,
25, wearing pale green scrubs
said the
and an
girl
expression that
wasn't
hovered somewhere
far
between
enough,
polite and
so
exhausted.
I was down there,
"Just checking in, Mrs. Whitmore," he said.
like,
"Margaret,"
7 o'clock
I almost
last
corrected him.
night, like,
I had
I'd
always
be
disliked being reduced to my
"Oh,
surname
Margaret,
like a file in a
it's okay,
cabinet,
we had enough,
but I let it go.
we're good."
"I'm fine," I said. He glanced around the room quickly, ticking invisible boxes in his mind. "Dinner's served downstairs until 9:30. Tonight we've got shepherd's pie." The way he said it made it sound like an achievement. I thanked him and decided to go. Staying in the room felt worse than facing the dining hall. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and something sweet, maybe overripe bananas. The carpet swallowed the sound of footsteps, giving the hallway an oddly muffled quality, like walking inside a thick coat. When I reached the dining room, several residents were already seated at round tables. Some stared quietly at their plates. Others watched the television mounted in the corner, where a cooking show played with the volume slightly too loud. A woman across from me introduced herself as Dorothy, 82, former librarian. Her hands trembled gently as she lifted her fork. "First week?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She nodded in the slow, knowing way of someone who had seen many first weeks. "They all say it's temporary," she murmured. Something in the way she said it made me pause. "What do you mean?" Dorothy shrugged lightly and took another bite of the shepherd's pie, which looked as though it had been assembled by someone who had only heard rumors of potatoes. "Families say that," she said. "Temporary." Then she added quietly, "Most don't come back." I told myself she was simply bitter. People sometimes grow bitter when life corners them. But later that night, after my call with Linda, the one where she told me about the locksmith, I sat in that small blue-curtained room and began replaying every conversation from the past 2 years. Andrew's questions, the sudden memory tests, Dr. Kessler's careful notes. I remembered one afternoon last winter when Andrew insisted on organizing my paperwork to make things easier. He had spent nearly an hour in Daniel's old study, opening drawers, asking about property taxes, insurance documents, even the deed folder Daniel kept wrapped in brown paper. At the time, I had simply made us both tea and admired his sudden sense of responsibility. Now that memory felt different, sharper. Like discovering that a pleasant melody you've been humming for months is actually a warning siren played at a lower pitch. The next morning, I went to the reception desk. A woman named Carol, the same cheerful guide from yesterday, looked up with a practiced smile. "Good morning, Margaret. How are we today?" "We." People in places like this always said, "we." "We're doing fine," I replied calmly, "but I'd like to go home for a few hours, just to check on things." Her smile didn't vanish, but it changed. "Oh, I'm afraid we'd need to clear that with your son first." "My son?" I repeated. "Yes. Andrew is listed as your primary contact and care coordinator." Care coordinator. I felt the words settle heavily in my chest. "I didn't realize I needed permission to visit my own house," I said. Carol gave a sympathetic tilt of her head, the kind receptionists master after years of dealing with uncomfortable conversations. "It's just part of the process, Margaret. Safety procedures." Safety. That word again. I thanked her politely and walked back toward my room. But as I passed the lounge area, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to yesterday. A bulletin board covered with laminated schedules, medication times, meal hours, visiting slots. And beneath them all, printed neatly in black letters. Resident Movement Policy. For the first time since arriving at Silver Pines, I felt a cold certainty form inside me. This place was not meant to be temporary, and somewhere, very carefully, someone had already made sure I wouldn't be leaving whenever I pleased. The call with Linda changed everything. Linda Morales had lived next door to me for nearly 18 years. A retired schoolteacher with sharp eyes, sharper opinions, and a fondness for growing basil in clay pots along her porch railing. If something unusual happened on Cedar Hill Drive, Linda usually noticed it before the mailman did. When she answered the phone that morning, I could hear wind chimes ringing softly in the background. "Margaret? Oh, goodness. I've been wondering where you were." "I'm staying somewhere for a little while," I said carefully. Andrew thought it might be safer. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The kind of pause that doesn't happen when someone simply accepts what you've said. Then Linda spoke again. "Well, that explains the locksmith, I suppose." My hand tightened around the phone. "The locksmith?" "Yes. Yesterday morning, around noon, I think, a white van pulled up in front of your house. Andrew was there." The room at Silver Pines suddenly felt smaller. "What exactly happened?" I asked. "Well," Linda continued slowly, "they changed the lock on your front door. Took about 20 minutes. Andrew stood there the whole time, watching. For a moment, I thought perhaps I had misheard her. Changed the lock. On my house. But that doesn't make sense," I said. "I still have my keys." Linda sighed softly. "Margaret, new lock means new keys." The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread through my mind. Memories, conversations, small moments that suddenly refused to stay harmless. I pictured Andrew in my kitchen last winter, sorting through my documents. "Just helping you stay organized, Mom." I remembered Dr. Kessler's gentle voice during the last appointment. "We're simply monitoring cognitive safety, Margaret." Safety again. Always safety. Linda cleared her throat gently on the phone. "I thought maybe you knew," she said. "Andrew told the locksmith you were moving permanently." The word permanently echoed in my head. "That can't be right," I said quickly. "I'm only here for a few weeks." Another pause. "Margaret," Linda said carefully, "there was a real estate agent here 2 days ago." For the second time that morning, my heart seemed to drop a few inches lower in my chest. A real estate agent? Yes. She walked around the outside of the house with Andrew, took photos, looked through the windows. I closed my eyes. For 42 years, that house had been my center of gravity. Every room held pieces of my life with Daniel. Sunday breakfasts with apricot jam, the smell of cedar from his workshop. Quiet winter evenings when the fireplace snapped softly while snow pressed against the windows. And now strangers were photographing it, like a property, not a home. "Linda," I said quietly, "did Andrew say anything to you? He mentioned you were transitioning into assisted living." His words. Transitioning. I almost laughed at how tidy the word sounded, as though my life were a spreadsheet being adjusted. Linda's voice softened. "Margaret, are you sure everything is all right?" I hesitated. Until that moment, part of me had still clung to the possibility that there had been a misunderstanding, that perhaps Andrew had simply acted too quickly, trying to help in the clumsy way adult children sometimes do. But locksmiths don't appear by accident. Real estate agents don't photograph homes without intention. And doctors don't quietly support those decisions without documentation. 2 years. The thought surfaced slowly. What if this had not begun 2 months ago? What if it had begun much earlier?
So,
I thanked Linda and hung up the phone,
yes,
but I didn't return to my room immediately.
these are
Instead,
some
I walked
tips
slowly down
on
the corridor at Silver Pines.
Spruce Tree,
The place looked different now.
treehouse
Yesterday, I had seen soft lighting and tidy carpets.
tree, and
Today, I
we
noticed the
have
keypad on the exit door.
that
The way staff members glanced up whenever a resident approached the lobby, the small plastic bracelets some residents wore around their wrists. I stopped near the lounge window and looked outside. A delivery truck was unloading boxes near the back entrance. 2 nurses pushed a wheelchair across the courtyard, while a man with silver hair stared silently at a bird feeder. For the first time since arriving, a very precise thought formed in my mind.
So made a tea.
If Andrew had already changed the locks, if a real estate agent had already photographed the house,
Really just added
then the decision about my future had been made long before I packed that burgundy suitcase.
them and then just
I turned away from the window,
simmer
and as I walked
bit
back toward my
and
room, another thought followed closely behind the first. If my son had been planning this for years, then somewhere there had to be proof.
we have
Once the idea formed in my mind that this had been planned, it refused to leave. I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in the small armchair beside my window at Silver Pines, my Darjeeling tea growing cold in my hands, while my thoughts moved slowly backward through the past 2 years. At 75, memory doesn't disappear the way people imagine. It simply becomes selective. You remember the things that matter. And suddenly, many things began to matter. The first memory that returned to me was from nearly 18 months ago. I had been in Dr. Kessler's office for what I believed was a routine blood pressure check. The appointment had been oddly long. After the usual examination, he began asking a series of questions that felt strangely formal. Margaret, do you ever feel disoriented when you wake up? No. Have you experienced difficulty managing your household finances? No. Do you ever forget where you are while driving? I remember laughing at that one. Doctor, I've been driving the same 3 streets for 20 years. If I forget where I am, Cedar Hill Drive will have to move. He smiled politely, but he kept writing in the file. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Doctors write things down. That's what they do. But now another detail came back to me. Andrew had been in the room during that appointment. That was unusual. My son rarely attended my medical visits before then. Yet suddenly, he had begun appearing more frequently, sitting quietly in the chair beside the desk, listening carefully as doctor. Kessler asked his questions, almost as if he were collecting information. The second memory came from the following spring. Andrew had insisted on helping me simplify my paperwork. He spent an entire afternoon in Daniel's old study, opening drawers of the teak filing cabinet my husband had built with such pride years ago. I remember him holding up the property deed folder. "Mom, you should really keep digital copies of these," he said. "Why?" I asked. "Just in case something happens?" Something happens. That phrase now carried a weight it never had before. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, letting the pieces fall where they would. Another memory surfaced. About 9 months ago, Dr. Kessler had adjusted one of my medications, a mild prescription meant to help with sleep. He explained that it might occasionally cause light confusion if taken too late in the evening. At the time, I accepted his explanation without question. But 2 weeks after starting that medication, Andrew had visited unexpectedly one morning. "Mom, you seem a little forgetful lately," he said gently. Forgetful. The word echoed inside my head now, like a dropped coin rolling across a marble floor. I opened my eyes again. The room at Silver Pines looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Quiet, tidy, faintly impersonal. But my understanding of the situation had shifted completely. This had not begun with the brochures. It had not begun with the care home suggestion. It had begun long before that. 2 years of small conversations. 2 years of carefully written notes in medical records. 2 years of quiet observations being turned into something official, a narrative. That was the word that came to me. Someone had been building a narrative about me. Margaret Whitmore, age 75. Increasingly forgetful. Possibly unsafe, living alone. Needs supervision. And once that narrative existed, in enough documents, enough files, enough conversations, it became reality, whether it was true or not. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I looked up as the door opened and a nurse stepped inside. She was younger than most of the staff, perhaps early 30s, with dark hair tied neatly into a braid that rested over her shoulder. I had seen her briefly the day before, but we had not spoken. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she said. "Yes?" She stepped in and closed the door gently behind her. "I'm Elena," she said. "I just wanted to check how you're settling in." Her voice carried a softness that felt genuine rather than practiced. "I'm settling," I replied carefully. She nodded and glanced around the room before lowering her voice slightly. "You're new here," she said. "It can take some getting used to." I studied her face for a moment. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite place. Not pity, something closer to concern. "Tell me something honestly, Elena," I said. She hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. Do most people come here temporarily?" For a brief moment, the room grew very quiet. Elena looked toward the door, then back at me. Finally, she said slowly, "Sometimes that's what families say." The same words Dorothy had used. My stomach tightened. "But?" I asked. Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the sleeve of her uniform, clearly choosing her next words carefully. "Sometimes," she said at last, "the paperwork tells a different story." Paperwork. That word settled heavily in my mind, because paperwork meant records, and records meant something very important. Evidence. If Andrew and Dr. Kessler had truly been preparing this plan for years, then somewhere, written down in calm professional language, was the version of me they had created. And if I could see it, I might finally understand exactly how they had taken my life away from me. After Elena left my room, I didn't move for several minutes. Paperwork. Such a harmless word on the surface. People imagine paperwork as dull things. Forms, signatures, dull gray folders stacked inside cabinets. But paperwork has a peculiar power. Once something is written down in the right place by the right person, it begins to look like truth. And if a doctor writes it, people rarely question it at all. I stood up slowly and walked to the small window overlooking the courtyard. Outside, a thin autumn wind was moving the branches of a young maple tree planted near the walking path. 2 residents shuffled along the pavement with a nurse trailing gently behind them like a shepherd guiding sheep. From a distance, the place looked peaceful, orderly, safe. But now I was beginning to see the structure underneath. Silver Pines was not simply a residence, it was a system. Every resident had files, charts, medication schedules, official evaluations, policies, procedures, assessments.
Like,
And somewhere inside that system, there would be a file with my name on it.
yeah.
Margaret Whitmore, age 75. Condition,
Okay.
whatever Dr. Kessler had decided to write. The thought made my stomach tighten. Because if the paperwork Elena mentioned truly existed, then someone had already defined me inside those records, defined what I was capable of, defined whether I could live alone, defined whether I was safe, and if Andrew had been involved in those conversations. I had a very uncomfortable suspicion about what those documents might say.
We have to such a
Later that afternoon, I returned to the dining room for tea. Not because I was hungry, but because sitting alone in my room made the walls feel too close. Dorothy was there again, stirring sugar into a cup of tea that looked suspiciously like colored water.
trying to get these
"You're thinking,"
half of them,
she
I
said,
had to pick
without
them
looking up.
off the ground.
"Is it that obvious?" Dorothy smiled
The
faintly.
other half,
People here either watch television
I was able
or
to
they
like,
think.
pick them off the tree, which I'm
And
sure
thinking
you
usually means trouble.
not
I sat down across from her.
but
"Dorothy,"
there was
I said
only, like,
carefully,
little branches
"do
that
residents
you
ever
could
see their own
the
records?"
rest of them were up
She raised one eyebrow. "That depends." "On what?" "On who's asking." Her answer wasn't exactly helpful, but the way she said it told me something important.
waiting on
It wasn't
those.
impossible. "Why?"
While we're
she
waiting
asked.
on those,
"What are you looking for?" I hesitated. Then I said quietly, "The truth." Dorothy studied my face for a moment, then leaned slightly closer across the table. "Let me give you a piece of advice," she said. "Please do. Places like this run on documentation. Everything is written down. Every pill, every conversation, every little observation." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," I said. She shook her head.
and so we should
"No,
just
Margaret.
get-
That's exactly what might save you."
I'm gonna
I
assume
frowned. "How so?" Dorothy tapped her spoon lightly against the edge of her cup. "Because lies get complicated when people start writing them down." I felt something shift in my chest. Dorothy continued. "If your son and your doctor really pushed you into this place," she said quietly,
fresh
"then
out
somewhere
the
they had to
box.
explain why." Why? The word echoed in my mind. And explanations written on paper, leave trails, dates, notes, signatures. The kind of details that don't always agree with each other. For the first time since arriving at Silver Pines, a different feeling crept into my thoughts. Not fear, curiosity, careful, patient curiosity. Because if the story Andrew and Dr. Kessler had written about me existed somewhere inside this building, then perhaps all I needed to do was find it. And once I saw exactly what they had claimed about me, I might finally understand how to prove it wrong. That evening, I began paying attention. Not in the obvious way people notice things when they're curious. No. I watched the way my husband Daniel used to watch chessboards, quietly, patiently, letting the pieces reveal their patterns. Silver Pines had patterns. Breakfast at 7:30. Medication carts at 8. Physical therapy appointments mid-morning. Visitors arriving after lunch with balloons, flowers, and carefully rehearsed smiles. But the most interesting pattern revolved around paperwork. Every afternoon around 2 o'clock, a rolling cart appeared at the nurses' station in the hallway. Thick folders stacked neatly in gray plastic trays. Nurses and aides would take turns opening them, writing notes, checking boxes, sliding documents back inside. Charts, resident records. I noticed Elena there twice that week. She worked with calm efficiency, occasionally tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear while she wrote. Unlike some of the other staff, she never spoke loudly over the residents. She lowered her voice when she needed to discuss something, Small details like that matter when you're trying to decide whether someone can be trusted.
I like it.
On Thursday afternoon, I walked slowly down the corridor with my knitting bag draped over my arm, pretending to look for a comfortable chair near the window. Instead, I paused near the nurse's station. Elena looked up. "Margaret?" she said gently. "Everything all right?" "I hope so," I replied. She noticed the seriousness in my voice immediately. "Would you like to sit?" she asked, gesturing toward a chair beside the desk. I sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said quietly, "Elena, I'd like to see my records." Her pen stopped moving. The hallway felt unusually silent. "You mean your medical chart?" she asked. "Yes." She leaned back slightly, clearly choosing her words with care. "Residents do have the right to request access," she said slowly. "But usually that goes through administration first." Administration. Another word that sounded harmless while hiding an entire maze behind it. "Is there a reason you want to see them?" she asked. I held her gaze. "Because I think something about them may not be accurate." Elena studied my face for a long moment. I could almost see the professional part of her mind weighing policies against instincts. Finally, she lowered her voice. "Your primary physician is listed as Dr. Leonard Kessler." "Yes." "And your son Andrew is documented as your medical advocate." "Advocate." That word nearly made me laugh. "Yes," I said quietly. Elena nodded slowly. "Then your file is probably extensive." I expected as much. Another pause settled between us. Then Elena leaned forward slightly and said something that made my pulse quicken. "The administrative office closes early on Fridays." I frowned. "Tomorrow is Friday." She nodded. "And sometimes," she continued carefully, "when paperwork is transferred between departments, charts sit temporarily in the review cabinet before being filed again." My mind sharpened instantly. "Where is this cabinet?" I asked. Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she glanced down the corridor. "Second door past the therapy room," she said quietly. "Staff records room." I let the information settle without reacting too quickly. "Thank you," I said. She met my eyes again. "Margaret," she added softly, "if there's something wrong in those files, it's better to know." "Yes," I replied. "Better to know." That night, I lay awake in the narrow bed, listening to the quiet mechanical rhythm of the building. Doors opening, distant footsteps, a cart rolling somewhere down the hallway. Somewhere in this place there was a folder with my name on it. Inside that folder would be the official version of Margaret Whitmore, the woman Andrew and Dr. Kessler had described to the world. Forgetful, unsafe, unable to live alone. But the thing about written stories is this: once you read them carefully enough, you begin to see where they stop matching reality. And tomorrow, for the first time since I arrived at Silver Pines, I intended to read the story they had written about me. Friday mornings at Silver Pines always smelled faintly of cinnamon oatmeal. It drifted from the dining hall down the corridor in a warm, sleepy cloud that made the place feel almost comfortable, almost like an ordinary apartment building instead of a carefully controlled facility. Almost. I ate breakfast slowly that day. 2 slices of toast, 1 boiled egg, weak coffee that tasted vaguely like burnt acorns. Around me, the dining room hummed with its usual quiet routines: forks scraping plates, a television muttering the morning news, aides reminding residents about medication schedules. I watched the clock above the door: 9:10, 9:25, 9:40. Patience had always been one of my strengths. Daniel used to say I could outwait a thunderstorm. By 10 o'clock, the administrative office door down the hall had already closed for the day. I had seen the manager leave with a leather briefcase tucked under her arm. Now the building moved with a slightly different rhythm. Fewer supervisors. More routine. Exactly the kind of environment where small, unnoticed movements become possible. I returned to my room briefly, picked up my knitting bag, and stepped into the hallway as though I were simply looking for a sunny chair. The therapy room stood halfway down the corridor, its glass door revealing 2 residents slowly lifting rubber exercise bands under the supervision of a physical therapist. Second door past it. Just as Elena had said, the staff records room door looked completely ordinary. Beige paint, metal handle, a printed sign taped at eye level, authorized personnel only. The hallway was empty. I walked past the door once without stopping. Then I turned around. My heart was beating faster now, not from fear exactly, but from the electric awareness that I was about to step directly into the machinery that had been built around me. I tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the room smelled faintly of paper and printer toner. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls. A desk sat near the window with a computer monitor, still glowing faintly in sleep mode. And against the far wall stood a tall gray cabinet. Review files. My pulse quickened. I closed the door gently behind me and walked over to the cabinet. Inside were dozens of folders arranged alphabetically, each tab labeled with neat printed names: Baker, Chen, Delgado. My fingers moved slowly through them. Foster, Grant, Henderson. Then I saw it. Whitmore, Margaret. The folder felt heavier than I expected when I pulled it free. I carried it to the desk and opened it carefully. The first page was a standard intake form. Name: Margaret Elaine Whitmore. Age: 75. Primary physician: Leonard Kessler, MD. Emergency contact: Andrew Whitmore. So far, nothing surprising. I turned the page. The next section contained medical notes. My eyes moved quickly across the lines. Patient demonstrates increasing episodes of disorientation. Reports from family indicate memory lapses. Recommended supervised living environment due to cognitive decline. Cognitive decline. I felt my jaw tighten. I kept reading. Many of the notes were written in Dr. Kessler's precise handwriting. Dates stretched back nearly 2 years. 2 years. The timeline was exactly as I had feared. But then I reached a page that made my stomach twist. It was a formal evaluation report. Under the section titled Family Observations, Andrew had written a statement. My mother has recently become forgetful and occasionally confused about daily tasks. I worry she may leave appliances on or wander outside at night. I stared at the sentence. In 75 years of life, I had never once wandered outside in the middle of the night. Not once. My eyes moved further down the page, and that's when I noticed something else. A note written by Dr. Kessler several months earlier. Family expresses concern about patients' financial decision-making, recommending review of property management and long-term guardianship options. Guardianship. The word made the room feel suddenly colder, because guardianship meant legal control. Control over finances, control over property, control over where a person lived. My house. The pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. This was never about my safety. This was about ownership. Andrew hadn't simply helped move me into a care home. He had been laying the groundwork to take control of everything I owned. I flipped another page, and there, clipped neatly into the file, was something that made my blood run cold. A signed document draft. petition for guardianship review.
I
The
think
signature
you're
line
right.
for
Oh,
Andrew
yeah,
Whitmore had already been filled out,
Look at that.
but the evaluation section, Doctor. Kessler's final medical confirmation was still blank, meaning the process hadn't been completed yet. Not yet. For the first time since opening the file, I allowed myself a slow breath, because suddenly I understood something crucial. Their plan wasn't finished. And if the plan wasn't finished, then I still had time to stop it.
Good thing that
I closed the folder slowly,
exercise part
not because I was finished reading it, but because my hands had started to tremble, and I didn't want the pages to shake. 2 years. 2 years of quiet notes, small observations, and carefully phrased concerns, building a portrait of a woman who barely resembled me.
Yeah, it's
Margaret Whitmore, age 75. Confused, forgetful, unsafe. I ran my fingers lightly over the edge of the paper where Andrew's handwriting curved neatly across the page. My mother occasionally becomes disoriented. The sentence looked so calm sitting there in black ink. No hesitation, no doubt. Just a statement that could change the course of someone's life. I flipped the page again. More notes from Dr. Kessler. Patient advised to consider supervised living arrangement. Family involvement recommended for decision-making. Long-term guardianship evaluation suggested. Each line was written in the tidy language doctors use when they want to sound objective, professional, responsible. But now that I read them closely, something about the wording began to bother me. Not what the sentences said, when they were written. I looked again at the dates. One note from 14 months ago claimed that Andrew had reported increasing confusion about household finances. 14 months ago. I frowned slightly, because 14 months ago, I had spent an entire weekend preparing my tax documents for the accountant, something that requires a fair amount of attention to detail. I remembered it clearly. I had even balanced the ledger twice because one number refused to align properly. That didn't sound like someone losing track of her finances. I flipped back 2 pages. Another note caught my attention.
It also has to
Patient reports difficulty managing daily medications. That one made me blink. I didn't even take daily medications at that time. Dr. Kessler had only prescribed the sleep aid months later, which meant something very strange had happened. Either the note was written incorrectly, or the timeline had been adjusted. I felt a slow chill crawl up the back of my neck, because suddenly the pattern inside the file began to look less like medical observation and more like construction, piece by piece, statement by statement, creating a narrative that slowly transformed me from a perfectly capable woman into someone who needed supervision. I leaned closer over the desk and examined the pages again. Many of Dr. Kessler's notes used identical phrases. Increasing concern. Family reports difficulty. Recommending monitoring. Almost as if they had been written to support a conclusion that had already been decided. Then my eyes landed on something even more interesting. A document clipped near the back of the folder. A consultation summary. The date was 6 months ago. Under the section labeled Family Meeting, there was a short paragraph written by Dr. Kessler. Discussed future guardianship considerations with patient's son. Family expresses willingness to assume responsibility for patient's financial and residential decisions if cognitive decline progresses. I read the sentence twice. The wording seemed harmless at first glance, but something about it unsettled me. Family expresses willingness. That meant Andrew had already discussed guardianship with the doctor. 6 months ago. 6 months before I was ever shown a single brochure for Silver Pines. Which meant the idea of placing me here hadn't started with concern about my safety. It had started much earlier, in conversations I hadn't even been part of.
Yellow.
I felt anger rise slowly inside my chest. Not the hot, explosive kind, but something colder and far more focused. The kind Daniel used to call engineering anger. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that builds. I carefully returned the pages to the folder exactly as I had found them. But before closing it, I looked once more at the guardianship petition clipped to the back. Andrew's signature was already there. Confident, certain, as though the outcome were inevitable. But the doctor's final certification line remained empty. Blank. Waiting. And that blank space suddenly felt like the most important detail in the entire room, because it meant something very simple. Their story about me was not finished yet, and stories that aren't finished can still be changed. I returned the folder to the cabinet exactly the way I had found it. Whitmore, Margaret. The tab slid neatly back between Walters and Yamamoto, disappearing into the quiet order of the filing system as though nothing had happened. For a moment, I simply stood there in the staff records room, listening. A cart rattled somewhere down the hallway. A distant voice laughed. The building continued its slow, indifferent rhythm. No one had noticed me. Good. I walked calmly back to my room, knitting bag over my arm, exactly the way I had come. The key to moving unnoticed, I've learned over the years, is to behave as though you belong wherever you are. By the time I reached my room, however, the calm mask began to slip. I sat down in the armchair and let the weight of what I had just discovered settle into place. Andrew had already signed the guardianship petition. That meant he wasn't simply helping me transition into assisted living. He was preparing to legally control my life. Guardianship is not a small thing. It means a court can declare a person incapable of managing their own affairs. Once that happens, the guardian gains authority over finances, property, medical decisions, sometimes even where the person lives. In other words, if Andrew succeeded, my house would no longer truly belong to me. And judging by the photographs Linda mentioned, he had already begun acting as though it didn't. But the most important detail remained the same. The doctor's final certification line was still blank, which meant Dr. Kessler had not yet submitted the official medical declaration that I was mentally unfit. Without that declaration, the guardianship process couldn't move forward. I stood and began pacing slowly across the room. One thing had become very clear. Andrew and Dr. Kessler were not improvising. They were following a process, step by step. First, build a record of concern. Second, place me in a supervised environment. Third, complete the guardianship certification. Fourth, I didn't need to read the rest of the plan to understand it. Once guardianship was approved, Andrew could legally manage my finances, including my house. My house on Cedar Hill Drive, with its apple tree leaning east and Daniel's workshop still smelling faintly of cedar and machine oil. I stopped pacing and looked out the window again. The courtyard maple tree rustled softly in the wind. For the first time since arriving at Silver Pines, the fear that had been hovering over me began to change shape. Fear is a strange emotion. At first, it freezes you, makes everything feel heavy and uncertain. But once you understand exactly what you're afraid of, fear becomes information, and information can be used. I sat down at the small desk beside the bed and pulled a notepad from the drawer. Then I began writing. Dates, notes, questions. The timeline from the folder was still fresh in my mind. 14 months ago. First, financial confusion note. 9 months ago, medication change. 6 months ago, guardianship conversation between Andrew and Dr. Kessler. 2 weeks ago, brochures for Silver Pines. 3 days ago, locksmith. 2 days ago, real estate agent. Today, I discovered the file. Seeing it written in front of me made something painfully obvious. Andrew believed he was already near the finish line. He believed the narrative had been built successfully. All that remained was the doctor's final certification, and then the court process. But what Andrew didn't know, what neither he nor Dr. Kessler could possibly know yet, was that I had seen their story. And once you've read the story someone writes about you, you can start finding the parts that don't make sense. The lies, the contradictions, the little details that collapse when someone begins asking the right questions. I set the pen down and looked at the list. The plan Andrew had built over 2 years looked impressive on paper. But like many plans, it had one critical weakness. It depended on everyone believing I was exactly the woman described in those medical notes. Confused, forgetful, passive. A woman who would quietly accept whatever decisions were made for her. I leaned back in the chair and allowed myself a slow breath. Because Andrew had made one very serious mistake. He had built an entire strategy around a version of his mother that didn't exist anymore. And now that I understood his plan, it was time to start dismantling it. Once you understand a plan, the next step is patience. That weekend, I behaved exactly the way Andrew expected me to behave. I attended the morning stretching session in the lounge. I drank the weak coffee in the dining hall. I even sat through a game of bingo on Saturday afternoon beside Dorothy, who whispered sarcastic commentary about the numbers like a sports announcer narrating a particularly dull match. On the surface, I was simply another elderly woman settling into life at Silver Pines. Inside my mind, however, I was working. Every plan has pressure points, places where it relies on assumptions rather than facts. My job was to find them. The first pressure point was Dr. Kessler. Without his final medical certification, the guardianship petition Andrew had signed meant nothing. Courts require professional confirmation before declaring someone mentally incompetent, which meant that sooner or later, Dr. Kessler would need to evaluate me again. And when he did, he would expect to see the same woman described in his notes. Forgetful, confused, declining. That assumption gave me an advantage. Monday afternoon, Andrew came to visit. He entered the lounge carrying a small paper bag from a bakery downtown, the one that sells those little almond financiers Daniel used to love. The gesture might have looked thoughtful to anyone watching. To me, it felt like theater. "Hi, Mom," he said warmly. I smiled. "Hello, Andrew." He sat beside me and handed me the bag. "Your favorite." I opened it and inhaled the scent of toasted almonds and butter. "Thank you." For a few minutes, we spoke about harmless things. The weather, the traffic near Maple Avenue, a neighbor's dog that had apparently learned to open trash cans. Then Andrew shifted slightly in his chair. "How are you settling in here?" he asked. "Quite well," I said calmly. He nodded, clearly relieved. "That's good. We just want you somewhere safe." Safe? There it was again. I looked at him carefully. "You've been very busy lately," I said. "Oh?" Linda told me about the locksmith. Andrew froze for the briefest fraction of a second. Then he recovered. "Oh, that," he said quickly. "Just a precaution. You know how empty houses can attract trouble." A neat explanation. Prepared. "And the real estate agent?" I asked. His expression tightened slightly. "I was just exploring options," he said. "Nothing decided." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch. Andrew had always hated silence.
No-fly zone for Mary 'cause
Sure enough, he
living
spoke again.
there also
Dr. Kessler actually wants to check in with you later this week, he said. Just a routine evaluation, nothing stressful. There it was,
I had
the
two
final step
things
of the
that
plan.
just needed to
Of
like
course, I said pleasantly.
have a purpose.
Andrew studied my face for a moment, as though searching for signs of confusion or resistance. He found none.
Did put a
Good,
splash of lime in
because the
there
woman
with
sitting
it,
beside him looked exactly like the one he expected.
exactly how
Quiet,
I'm trying to
cooperative,
like,
slightly tired.
exactly.
But inside, something very different was happening. The evaluation he mentioned would likely determine everything.
Gel just
If Dr. Kessler confirmed the narrative written in those records, Andrew's guardianship petition would move forward. If he didn't, the entire structure could collapse. Andrew stood up after a few minutes. I should get going, he said. Work tomorrow. He leaned down and kissed my cheek. Everything's going to be all right, Mom. I watched him walk out of the lounge. The door closed softly behind him. Dorothy, who had been pretending to read a magazine nearby, leaned over. That looked tense, she murmured. Perhaps, I said. She studied me curiously. You don't look worried. I smiled faintly. That's because I finally understand the situation. And understanding changes everything. I folded my hands calmly in my lap, because now I knew when the final move in Andrew's plan would happen. Dr. Kessler's evaluation. The appointment that would decide whether I remained Margaret Whitmore, the woman who owned her life, or the version of me written in a folder inside a gray cabinet. Fortunately for me, doctors sometimes forget one important thing. Patients can prepare for evaluations too. Wednesday arrived quietly. If Andrew was nervous about the upcoming evaluation, he hid it well. He called that morning with the same careful tone he had used for weeks. Calm, patient, almost overly gentle. Dr. Kessler will stop by this afternoon, he said. Just a routine follow-up. Routine. That word had begun to sound almost amusing to me. I'll be here, I told him. After the call ended, I spent the next several hours doing exactly what I had been doing all week, observing. Silver Pines had begun to feel less like a maze and more like a map. I knew when the medication carts rolled through the hallway. I knew which nurses worked the afternoon shift. I even knew that the large clock in the lounge ran about 3 minutes slow. These details might sound small, but small details are how you stay grounded when people are trying to convince the world you're losing your mind. At around 3 o'clock, Elena appeared at my door. He's here, she said softly. I nodded and stood up. Thank you. We walked together toward a small consultation room near the nurses' station. The room looked exactly like a dozen other medical offices I had visited in my life. Neutral walls, a desk, 2 chairs, and a faint smell of disinfectant that never quite fades. Doctor. Leonard Kessler sat behind the desk when I entered. He looked exactly the same as always. Gray suit, calm posture. That professional expression doctors learn somewhere during medical school. Margaret, he said warmly. Good to see you. Doctor. I sat down across from him. Andrew sat beside the desk, leaning slightly forward as though this meeting were extremely important, which of course it was. Dr. Kessler opened a thin folder in front of him, likely a condensed version of the records I had already read. How are you adjusting to Silver Pines? He asked. Quite comfortably, I replied. He nodded and began the familiar sequence. Have you experienced any recent confusion about time or place? No. Any difficulty managing your daily activities? None. His pen moved across the page. The questions continued for several minutes. Some were the same memory prompts he had used before. Please remember these 3 words: apple, carpet, silver. I almost smiled. Apple, carpet, silver, I repeated. 10 minutes later, he asked again. Apple, carpet, silver, I said. Andrew shifted slightly in his chair. Dr. Kessler continued. Do you feel safe managing your personal finances? Yes. Have you recently left appliances on or forgotten important tasks? No. My answers were calm, clear, precise, not defensive, not emotional, simply accurate. After about 20 minutes, Dr. Kessler closed the folder. Well, he said slowly, your responses seem quite consistent today. Andrew's jaw tightened slightly. What does that mean? He asked. Dr. Kessler adjusted his glasses. It means that Margaret appears oriented and capable during this evaluation. Andrew leaned forward. But I told you about the confusion she's been having. I watched Dr. Kessler carefully. For the first time since entering the room, he seemed slightly uncomfortable. Well, he said, family observations are important, but clinical assessment must rely on direct examination. The room grew quiet. Andrew's voice dropped a little. So you're saying she's fine? Dr. Kessler didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me again. Margaret, he said, do you feel capable of managing your own living arrangements? I met his gaze steadily. Yes, doctor, I said. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dr. Kessler slowly closed the folder. I will need to review the full record before making any final recommendations, he said carefully. Final recommendations. The phrase hung in the air, because everyone in the room understood what that meant. The final certification Andrew needed for the guardianship petition had not been given. Not yet. Andrew stood up abruptly. I think we should talk about this privately, he said to the doctor. Dr. Kessler nodded. Of course. I rose calmly from my chair. Thank you for the evaluation, doctor. He gave a polite smile. Thank you, Margaret. As I stepped out into the hallway, Elena glanced up from the nurse's station. Her eyes searched my face. Well? She asked quietly. I allowed myself the smallest smile. For the first time in 2 years, I said softly. Their story about me didn't go exactly the way they expected. I didn't return to my room immediately. Instead, I walked slowly down the corridor and into the small courtyard behind Silver Pines. The afternoon air was cool, carrying the faint smell of fallen leaves and distant rain. A few residents sat quietly along the walking path, wrapped in light blankets, while a nurse handed out small cups of tea. From the outside, the place still looked peaceful. But inside the consultation room behind me, something had shifted. Andrew had expected certainty. He had expected Dr. Kessler to confirm what had already been written in those files, that I was declining, confused, incapable of living on my own. Instead, the evaluation had produced something far more dangerous for him. Doubt. I sat down on a wooden bench beneath the young maple tree and let the situation settle into place. Plans built over years rarely collapse in a single moment. They weaken first. Cracks appear where the structure once seemed solid. Andrew's plan had just developed its first serious crack. A few minutes later, the back door opened. Elena stepped outside and spotted me immediately. They're still talking, she said quietly as she approached. I imagined they might be. She sat beside me on the bench. I've worked here for 3 years, she said. You learn to read people after a while. And what do you read now? I asked. She glanced toward the building. Your son didn't look happy. I smiled faintly. That makes two of us. For a moment, we sat in silence, watching the branches above us sway gently in the wind. Then Elena spoke again. Margaret, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Did you know about the guardianship petition before today? The question didn't surprise me. I saw it in my file, I said calmly. Elena nodded slowly. That's what I thought. You've seen cases like this before? I asked. Not exactly the same, she said. But sometimes families push harder than the situation really requires. Harder. That was a polite way of describing it. The back door opened again. Andrew stepped outside. His expression was carefully controlled, but the tightness around his mouth told me everything I needed to know. He walked toward us. Mom, he said, stopping a few feet away. We need to talk. Elena stood up immediately. I'll give you some space. As she walked back inside, Andrew turned toward me. You really should have told Dr. Kessler about the confusion you've been having, he said quietly. I looked up at him. What confusion would that be? His jaw tightened. You know what I mean? No, I said calmly. I don't. For a moment, the polite mask slipped from his face. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he muttered. Harder for whom? I asked. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. Mom, the house is too much for you now. You know that. I watched him carefully. My house has been standing for 42 years, I said. It managed just fine before this sudden concern for my safety appeared. Andrew exhaled slowly. You're not thinking clearly. That's an interesting statement, I replied, considering the doctor just said I was perfectly oriented. The words landed harder than I expected. Andrew looked away for a moment, gathering himself. Then he leaned slightly closer. This isn't over, he said quietly. I held his gaze. I'm aware of that. Because he was right. This wasn't over. The guardianship petition still existed. The records in my file still painted a picture of decline. And doctor. Kessler had not yet made his final recommendation. But as Andrew walked back toward the building, one thing had become unmistakably clear. For the first time since he started building his careful plan 2 years ago, something had begun moving in the opposite direction. 2 days passed after the evaluation. 2 quiet, ordinary days. Breakfast trays, medication carts, afternoon tea in the lounge. The routines of Silver Pines continued as though nothing important had happened. But underneath that calm surface, something was clearly shifting. Andrew did not visit. Dr. Kessler did not call. And I noticed Elena watching the hallway more often than usual, as if she expected something to happen at any moment. Late Friday morning, the receptionist announced that I had a visitor. When I walked into the small meeting room near the entrance, I found not one person waiting, but 3. Andrew, Dr. Kessler, and a woman I had never seen before, sitting neatly at the table with a leather briefcase open in front of her. Mom, Andrew said stiffly. The woman stood. Mrs. Whitmore, she said professionally. My name is Sandra Lowell. I'm a legal coordinator working with your son regarding the guardianship review. So the next step had arrived. They had moved the process forward. I sat down across from them calmly. Good morning, I said. Sandra opened a folder and began speaking in the steady tone of someone accustomed to uncomfortable meetings. As you may know, your son has filed a preliminary guardianship request. This is a standard review process designed to determine whether additional assistance with personal and financial decisions would benefit you. Benefit. Another one of those polite words. I glanced briefly at Andrew. He avoided my eyes. Sandra continued. As part of this process, Doctor, Kessler has been asked to provide a final medical evaluation confirming whether guardianship is appropriate. There it was. The moment Andrew had been building toward for 2 years. Sandra turned slightly toward the doctor. Dr. Kessler, have you completed your review of the medical record? The room grew very quiet. Dr. Kessler folded his hands on the table. I have, he said. Andrew leaned forward slightly. Sandra nodded. And your conclusion? Dr. Kessler looked at the folder in front of him for a moment before speaking. My conclusion, he said slowly, is that the current documentation contains several inconsistencies. Andrew's head snapped toward him. What? Sandra frowned slightly. Could you clarify? Dr. Kessler opened the folder and slid several pages across the table. Some of the earlier notes describing cognitive decline rely entirely on second-hand reports rather than direct observation, he explained. Andrew shifted uncomfortably. I told you what was happening, he said. Yes, Dr. Kessler replied evenly. You did. He turned another page. However, during my recent evaluation, Mrs. Whitmore demonstrated full orientation, intact memory recall, and no observable impairment in reasoning. Sandra looked from the doctor to Andrew. So, you're saying, I'm saying, Dr. Kessler continued, that I cannot ethically certify cognitive incapacity based on the evidence currently available. Andrew stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. Sandra raised a hand. Mr. Whitmore, you've been documenting this for 2 years, Andrew said, turning to the doctor. Dr. Kessler met his gaze calmly. I documented concerns, not incapacity. The difference was enormous, and everyone in the room understood it. Sandra closed the folder slowly. In that case, she said carefully, the guardianship petition cannot proceed. The words landed like a stone dropping through water. Andrew looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time since the meeting began, not as his aging mother, but as someone who had just dismantled the outcome he had expected. Friends, imagine sitting in that room after discovering a plan built over 2 years. Margaret stayed calm, spoke clearly, and suddenly, the entire story written about her began falling apart. Tell me honestly, what would you have done in her place? Andrew grabbed his coat. This isn't finished, he muttered again. Then he walked out. The door closed behind him, and for the first time since the locksmith had changed the locks on my front door, the balance of power in the room had completely changed. When the door closed behind Andrew, the silence in the room felt heavier than anything that had been said. Sandra Lowell gathered the papers slowly, sliding them back into her folder with the careful movements of someone who understood that the entire meeting had just taken an unexpected turn. Well, she said finally, that changes the legal situation considerably. Dr. Kessler remained seated, his hands folded in front of him. Yes, he replied quietly. It does. Sandra turned toward me. Mrs. Whitmore, without a physician's certification of incapacity, the guardianship petition cannot move forward. Your son may attempt to refile in the future, but based on today's evaluation, there is no legal basis for the request. In other words, Andrew had just lost the most important piece of the plan he'd been building for 2 years. I nodded calmly. Thank you for clarifying that. Sandra closed her briefcase. There is one additional matter, she said. I looked at her. Because the petition was filed citing concerns about your ability to manage your own affairs, the court typically recommends that the individual be offered the opportunity to review those concerns independently. Meaning? I asked. Meaning you have the right to request a formal review of the documentation used to support the petition. The documentation. The same notes I had already read in that gray cabinet. But hearing it said aloud in a legal context changed the weight of the situation. Because once those records were reviewed formally, every inconsistency inside them would matter. Dates, statements, claims. I glanced briefly at Dr. Kessler. He avoided my eyes for a moment. Sandra stood. If you wish to pursue that review, you may contact my office. I'll provide the paperwork. She handed me a small card. Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore. Then she left the room. Dr. Kessler remained seated for another moment. Finally, he stood as well. Margaret, he said quietly. Yes, doctor? I want to be clear about something. I waited. 2 years ago, your son expressed concerns about your safety. At the time, those concerns appeared reasonable. Did they? I asked. He hesitated. In hindsight, some of the conclusions may have been premature. Premature. That was a polite way of saying something had gone very wrong. I see, I said. Dr. Kessler adjusted his glasses. If you choose to return home, I will update your medical record accordingly. Return home. The words landed softly, but their meaning was enormous. Because for the first time since arriving at Silver Pines, someone in authority had acknowledged the possibility that I did not belong there at all. Thank you, doctor, I said. He nodded once and walked out. I remained in the room alone for a few moments. The quiet felt different now, not oppressive. Open. Eventually, I stood and walked slowly back into the hallway. Elena looked up from the nurse's station the moment she saw me. Well? She asked. I stopped beside the desk. The guardianship petition is finished, I said. Her eyes widened slightly. Finished? For now. A slow smile spread across her face. I had a feeling. Dorothy was sitting in the lounge again when I passed by. She lowered her newspaper. Judging by your expression, she said, something interesting just happened. I paused beside her chair. You remember what you said the other day? I asked. About documentation? Yes. Dorothy grinned. Lies get complicated when people start writing them down. I nodded. That's exactly what happened. But as I continued walking toward my room, another thought settled quietly in my mind. Andrew's plan had just collapsed. The guardianship petition had failed, but the locksmith had still changed the locks on my house. And somewhere on Cedar Hill Drive, strangers had already taken photographs of a home that did not belong to them, which meant that while one part of the story had ended, another part was only just beginning. 3 days later, I left Silver Pines. Not dramatically. No shouting, no arguments in the hallway, just a quiet discharge form, a signature at the front desk, and Elena handing me the same burgundy suitcase I had arrived with. You'll be all right? She asked. I smiled. I've been all right for 75 years. Dorothy waved from the lounge as I passed. Go enjoy your house, she called. I intend to, I replied. The taxi ride across town felt strangely familiar. The same streets, the same grocery store on Maple Avenue, the same bakery where Andrew had bought those almond financiers. Life had continued normally outside those walls. Only mine had been paused. When the taxi turned onto Cedar Hill Drive, my heart began beating a little faster. My house stood exactly where it always had. The brick walls warm in the afternoon sun. The apple tree still leaning gently to the east like an old friend waiting patiently. But as the taxi pulled into the driveway, I saw it immediately. The new lock. Linda stepped out onto her porch the moment she saw the car. "Margaret," she called. I stepped out of the taxi. "Well," I said, looking up at the house. "Here we are." Linda crossed the lawn toward me. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. "Andrew stopped by yesterday. Looked furious." "I'm not surprised." She glanced at the door. "You still can't get in, can you?" I looked at the shiny brass lock that did not belong there. "No," I said calmly. Then I walked up the front steps and ran my hand lightly over the wood of the door Daniel had installed 42 years earlier. For a moment, I simply stood there, not angry, not defeated, just thinking. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. "Who are you calling?" Linda asked. "A locksmith." She blinked. "Another one?" "Yes." The man arrived about 30 minutes later in a white van, the same kind Linda had described earlier in the week. He examined the lock, nodded once, and opened his toolbox. "Won't take long," he said. I stood on the porch while he worked. Metal clicked softly. Tools turned. The new lock came free from the door as easily as the last one had been installed. 20 minutes later, he handed me a small set of keys. All set. I paid him and thanked him. Then I stood there holding the key for a moment before sliding it into the lock. The door opened with the same familiar creak it had always had. Inside, the house smelled exactly the same. Cedar. Old books. A faint trace of machine oil from Daniel's workshop. I stepped across the threshold slowly. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I walked through the rooms quietly. The kitchen table where Andrew had once done his homework. The living room where Daniel used to read the newspaper every Sunday morning. The hallway where our family photographs still hung in their wooden frames. Finally, I returned to the front door. Linda was still standing outside. "Well?" she asked. I looked around the house once more. "I think," I said slowly, "I'll be just fine. Well, friends. Margaret got her house back, but families are complicated things. Some people will say she should forgive her son. Others might say trust, once broken like that, never returns. What do you think? And if this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me your thoughts in the comments.